Hello, and welcome to another Rant Rave review. Today is what I'm going to be calling a roundup, where I'm going to be reviewing 6 different books, but very briefly, all on the same topic. It is Japanese history, nonfiction concerning World War II or post-war Japan, because I'm like that. I'm a giant weeb, I've always loved Japan, and weirdly, I've kind of always had this fixation with that era. I vividly remember in 4th grade arguing with one of my classmates about whether or not we should have whether or not we should have bombed Hiroshima. So that's how I am. In high school, we had to do a report about inhumanity and sadness and bad things. Good job, teachers. I did mine about Hiroshima. Yeah. So I'm like, I don't know. This is just me, man. So anyway, I'm gonna do 6 books. Briefly, I'm going to start probably from the least interesting to the most interesting, I guess. So this one is a big, awesome book I got on sale from the library. It's called Return to Hiroshima. It was written in 1970, so very close to the events. I mean, closer than we are today. And it's mostly pictures, but it's also got some text explaining the way life is in Hiroshima. So talking about, for example, there's this really strange stigma against atomic bomb survivors where, outside, because, the city was wiped out, a lot of people died, outsiders moved in, it's free real estate, but you don't really, if you're a survivor, you don't really reveal that to other people. You're just and the idea of actual, very overt medical problems, babies who were in the womb during the bombing, a lot of them are born microcephalic, which is where you have a small head and you mentally don't age. And then, all kinds of radiation poisoning and such, dying early and cancers and such. But a lot of people have this fear of, I'm not sick now, but I might be in a couple years. It would just happen where you're totally fine, but then later you start showing effects of radiation poisoning because you were at the site of the bombing. So it's really sad and interesting. So that's just an interesting perspective. It's very stark. The other one, I don't have this book, but it was at the library that I used to work in, and it is called Unforgettable Fire: Pictures Drawn by Atomic Bomb Survivors. Which, let's pause here. One reason I find this subject so fascinating is because people act like you can't survive an atomic bomb. And I think that there's I think it's to make yourself feel better, which I might actually put in the book that I'm writing. On the one hand, you have people who are oh, well, if we all get nuked, if you talk about the 1950s and duck and cover, people are oh, that's so stupid, you couldn't survive. And it's actually, there were people who survived the atomic bombs in Japan because, they happened to be standing behind a bookcase. Yeah, and when the bomb dropped far away from them and blew out all the windows and there's glass flying, they didn't get glass friggin' in their face, and they got slightly less radiation. A woman was in a cement building and survived extremely close to the blast because of the cement. Because of the certain way the gamma rays and such work, you can survive depending on where you're at. Obviously, if you're not at the very center, you're gonna die, but if you're farther out, you can easily be killed by fire, glass, falling buildings, etc. So things like duck and cover actually would have saved you if you were in that zone. So, fun fact for your history today. So that's one thing of people being oh, you can't survive. I also think people tell themselves that you can't survive an atomic explosion to make the fact that we nuked Japan not once but twice easier on the conscience, because if you're thinking, oh, you just drop a bomb and everyone dies, but the fact is that tons of people didn't die and then had to deal with the effects of radiation for years and decades afterwards. So it's horrible. And immediately afterwards, let's get back to the book, Unforgettable Fire, the things that people saw on that day are nightmarish, literal hell on earth. Human beings aren't supposed to see such things. Huge trigger warnings for the next I don't know, let's say a minute. They, people were coloring and drawing the bodies, choking the rivers. Bodies of not just people but horses, because, Japan still had horses and carts and stuff at that time. Choking the rivers. In other books, there's reports of people like try to drink the water and it's like boiling and they die, but they're like so hot that they try to like cool themselves off. In this book, there's pictures like people walking around naked with their clothes blown off, their skin like coming off. Like that's what happened when we dropped the bombs. It's not just like, oh, we dropped the bombs and killed people. It's like, it's so much worse than you could ever imagine. And again, like those people eventually died pretty soon, but a lot of them like had to live with those scars forever. And then like all the people who saw this and are drawing this like have to live with radiation poisoning, and it's horrible. One of the most interesting things is if you've ever seen the first episode or the first chapter of Attack on Titan, this makes sense, I promise. When Aaron's mom is trapped under that house and she's like, they're trying to get her, like, you know, they realize they can't let her out, but the thing's coming and they have to run. I swear it's based, even if unintentionally, on this picture from this book where there was this famous artist who, he was basically playing hooky from school. He didn't want to go to school, so he stayed home, and that's probably why he survived the bombing, because his school was closer. And so, you know, the bomb drops, everything goes black, and then everything's on fire, and so, you know, you go out and try to help people, because you're like, holy cow, like, what is going on? And he saw this little girl whose mom was trapped under the house, like, literally, and he drew a picture of this, like, it's, like, literally the same picture of, like, Aaron's mom trapped in the house, like, it's, like, that image is, like, burned into, like, the consciousness of, like, Japan. I've seen it in other things, too, and they couldn't get her out, and her house was burning, and they were just basically like, we have to leave, or we'll get burned, too, and it's, like, it's so horrible. Yeah, like, this is a really heavy book, but I think it's a really important book, and I believe it was published in 1981. I really wish that more people would, like, carry it, because it's, like, if you hear accounts of it, it's horrible, but then, like, to see, like, the memories of, like, what people remember that day, it's, like, again, like, hellish. Like, it's horrible. So that's cheery. Okay, moving on. Let us go to another, a cheerier? Not cheerier. Okay, but it is. We'll get to it. So this is called The Bells of Nagasaki. And this was by a man who was a radiologist before the war. And I will tell you more about him in the last book, because there's another book about this guy. But his name is Takashi Nagai. He should probably be sainted, by the way. But anyway, he wrote this after the bombing. He was working in a hospital. I'm trying to remember exactly what happened. I think he was in a room and the roof collapsed on him, and he was, like, screaming for help. And in this book, what he does is he doesn't just describe his recollections, he describes recollections of a bunch of different people who worked in the hospital with him, because he probably would have died, except that this nurse, who was, like, 18 years old, was in the next room over, and she was the one who was standing behind a bookcase. She was, like, reaching for something, and the bomb hit, and he describes from her, like, what she told him is, like, everything went black, and then, like, she, like, went to the window to see what that, you know, the windows blew out. She went to the window to see what happened. They all thought it, you know, everyone's expecting to be firebombed, because we've been firebombing Japan for, you know, many months. So she goes to the window and she looks out, and there had been a line of people waiting for medical treatment, especially tuberculosis treatment. It was a big thing then. And she just sees them all dead. Like, again, like, just dead bodies, and the sky is, like, black and red. And she was like, is this hell? Like, she just, like, did not know, like, how to comprehend what was going on, because humans aren't supposed to see these things. And she just was, like, freaking out, like, didn't know what to do. And then she heard him calling from the other room, and she was like, snap, I'm a nurse. Like, I gotta go help that guy, because human beings are amazing. And that's, like, the takeaway from this topic is, as hideous and horrible as the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombings were, it, like, if you actually read accounts by survivors, it, like, proves the human spirit is, like, indomitable. It's insane. So she goes and helps him. They, again, with a bunch of other nurses and doctors and medical students, try to get everybody who's alive to the hills, because they can see that things are burning. And that's another thing that people don't think about with Hiroshima and Nagasaki is you drop the bomb, you kill a bunch of people, and then everything's on fire. So tons of people die in the fire also. So you get everybody out, they all go to the hills, At this point, Takashi Nagai has like a head wound and is bleeding, and I kid you friggin' not, they're trying to get people to like notice that like where to come, because there's doctor, you know, if you come to the people or doctors, come here. They like have a white sheet, and he like takes blood from his head wound and like draws a circle for the Japanese flag, because friggin' A, like it's insane. Like, and what I love about this too is it's like, you watch anime and you're like, that's a little much, and then you read things about actual accounts of like people's lives and you're like, maybe it's not a little much, maybe people are just this cool. So he talks about that, the immediate aftermath, you know, trying to find survivors in the hills, trying to get people food. And what's really fascinating about this one, and then I'll talk about another book in a sec. So their entire town, this was in Nagasaki, not Hiroshima, Nagasaki. And so their entire town was wiped out. His wife was killed, like incinerated, basically. He found like her bones and collected them in a pail. So your entire town is wiped out. Most people that you know are dead. He even talks about, they had like, you know, different nurses who were out walking around the grounds and like, they're dead now, like gone. There was one little, oh my gosh, this medical student where there was a bunch of them in a classroom and the bomb hit and like the roof collapsed and they were all trapped and it was burning, and only he managed to like basically dig his way through the wooden floor by stripping out the floor underneath it and going under, and everybody else is dying, and they're just like, you know, like, remember us, like, bye. It's like, how do you deal with that? Like, how do you deal with the fact that you know all of your classmates are gonna die, and they all know they're gonna die, and you escape? I don't know. Read this book. Read this book. So then, okay, so this has all happened to them, and then they get word that the emperor has surrendered, and they were like, what the heck? How dare you? Because they're, even though all of this stuff just happened, they're still super loyal and super like, how, like, then what was this for? You know, we've been sacrificing all this stuff for the war and gathering everything and keep on keeping on, and now we're surrendering? Like, how dare you? Which blows my mind. Again, the perspective of like, the way Japanese people felt. The vast majority of things I've read about this era, like, most people were like, how could he surrender? There is, I will say, the one opposite of that. If you ever heard of the story Barefoot Gen, apparently that was written by a guy whose mother was killed in the bombings, and he just, I forget where I was reading this, but he was on his way on a train back to Tokyo, and he was basically thinking, like, it's all the government's fault. Like, if they hadn't kept going, if they had just surrendered earlier, like, this wouldn't have happened. So you do have like different perspectives, and it's interesting, but these people were basically like, how dare he, like, surrender, what are you doing? But then, so they sit around for a few days being like incredibly depressed because, you know, everyone's dying, everyone's dead, we've surrendered, and then but then they're just like, you know what, like, we're doctors, we just have to keep on going and helping people. And that's what they did, and they just kept going, and they kept getting food, and they kept helping people, and they kept rebuilding like their town. And this is actually important. There's a cross on this. Nagasaki has this very large, I guess you'd say it's like the Christian center of Japan, which is only like, you know, 2% of the people anyway, but yeah. So there was I'll talk more about this in the next couple books, but there was a very big Christian population for a very good reason in Nagasaki. And so this author was Christian, and he basically looks at all of this in that perspective of like, if we had like, you know, basically almost as if the people of Nagasaki like can offer themselves as a burnt sacrifice for peace, and like, you don't have to let your deaths be meaningless. Like, it's really crazy. Like, this perspective, again, it's man, wife, dead, town destroyed, friends gone, and yet he's like at peace with it. It's amazing. You should read it. He also, it's really funny, he's a radiologist, so he the whole time is like, let's like talk about how this works. And immediately after the bombing, you had doctors being like, oh, what kind of rays were they? Like, how did it all work? Was this radiation? So yeah, he like, it's crazy to think about how you actually feel after a nuclear attack. You wouldn't think that you'd be so calm, and yet we have the evidence. It's right here. So that book. So that's 3. That's half of the books. The next 3 are even more amazing in my opinion. So this one is called Smile of a Ragpicker. It is by Paul Glynn, and I really like his books. This one is actually about a girl in Tokyo who, oh fudge, I actually should know where this happened. I don't remember. It's a certain district of Tokyo, and I was there. I don't know. Anyway, so basically, she was rich. She was also Catholic. Again, very rare, but she was. And she really, really wanted to become a nun, and repeatedly went and tried to become a nun. And they were like, nope, sorry, like, it's not your calling. Because nuns can do that. I don't know. If you're Catholic, if you're not Catholic, you don't just get to decide to be a nun or a priest or a monk. Like, you actually have to, like, feel a calling to it, and it has to fit. So they were like, nope, sorry. The different orders that she tried to get into. And then the war happened, and if you don't know, like, there was massive amounts of firebombing all over the country, all over Tokyo as well. 3/4 of all structures in Japan were destroyed during World War II, which is insane. Just think about that. Again, a lot of it was wooden, so it burned really easily. But there was one particular district in Tokyo, I do not remember what it's called, but it is near the Sky Tree, and it's also where that weird, like, lumpy golden thing is, if you've ever seen that weird sculpture. It's not very well described. Kind of where the Thunder Gate is. That general area. I'm not exactly sure exactly where it is, but there was a part of it that got really badly burned down. And so the people who lived there were like, we got nothing. We're basically like street people now. What are we going to do? And once the war ended, so this is post-war Japan. This is the one that's like particularly post-war. Once the war ended, they were like, we'll just like pick rags and like metal and sell it, basically recycling. And it actually was the first like grassroots recycling thing in Japan of these people who literally had to survive. They're just like, we're just going to like, you know, collect all the cans, etc., sell it, feed ourselves, okay. And it was this little group called, they called themselves Ants Town because ants are really hardworking. And so she ended up helping them. Again, like, even though she wasn't technically a religious sister, she did the kind of work that one would do as a sister, where you're going and you're helping people who don't have means, and you basically volunteer your time. So that was her. And then the fun part about this book, this is like much more uplifting than like the first 3-4 books that I talked about. There's 2 other, like, again, insane characters. Like, this might as well be an anime. There was an ex-Yakuza. It doesn't actually say he was ex-Yakuza, but, like, it's heavily implied that he probably was. He was, like, helping out the people of Ants Town. And then there was this, again, like, ex-actor or director who was, like, really overly dramatic who was helping them. And so you have these, like, 3 people. You have, like, the rich girl who wants to be a nun, and the crazy ex-actor who's, like, overdramatic, and so salty and mean and sarcastic, and just, like, whatever. And then you have this, like, Yakuza guy who just seems, like, very, like, all-in, good-hearted. And then you have another person who is this, I believe he's Polish Catholic priest who came to Japan and would basically do these, like, charity tours where he was, like, super famous and popular. He actually had worked with, I think he worked with Maximilian Kolbe, like, before Kolbe was sent to the concentration camps. But yeah, so he comes to Japan. He basically raises tons of funds for people. And so some of the people in Ants Town were like, we gotta get this guy, like, to talk about us. Also, because they're on this property, right? And they're living on this, like, but they don't really have any houses, the government kept trying to evict them because they're like, oh, you're, like, squatting. And so, you know, they might be homeless if they get evicted. And so the actor was a total atheist and was like, religion's ridiculous, all religion is stupid, but we can totally have this, like, Catholic priest join us to get, like, free publicity and make it look good. And so, like, that's what they did, and it's like almost like a bunch of crazy schemes, and it's uplifting and fun and kind of kooky, even though it's all real life, like kooky characters in real life. She eventually started teaching the kids at Ants Town because, you know, you still have to, like, learn things, and she's an educated, rich young woman. She would take them on field trips to the mountains, and then eventually, I forget what illness she had, but yeah, it's just a very, like, interesting, good little cute, like, good cute story about post-war Japan. Yay, not sad. Yay. Anyway, alright, so Then we have, another post-war Japan. Dear General MacArthur, Letters from the Japanese During the American Occupation. This is such an interesting book. 10 out of 10, like you should read it if you are all curious about Japan and the war experience. So, if you don't know, America nuked Japan, Japan surrendered, and then we occupied them for like 10 years. So we went in, established HQ, home office, and like basically kind of helped run the country. And it's interesting because these letters, how are they organized? Kind of organized by topics, so cozying up to the victor, which is a lot of people like, trying to be like, okay, America's like kind of running us now, like, how you doing, America? Hey. Invitations, please protect the emperor and depose the emperor, MacArthur as a father figure, gifts of thanks, etc., etc. So, what I love about this book is like insane and interesting perspectives. So, right away, if you don't know, a lot of Americans were like, oh, we should like try the emperor for war crimes. And MacArthur was like, no, we're not doing that. And a bunch of the Japanese, like the vast majority, were like, please, like you can like, take out the whole government, please, but don't hurt the emperor, like don't, like, please leave him alone. From what I know of it, from what I've read, the military-industrial complex that you hear people talk about? That was like a literal thing in Japan, where the military ran everything, and they were kind of horrible in World War II, like terrible. And the military and government were like this. And the emperor was like not even a figurehead. Like he just kind of was there. I guess you could call him a religious leader. And that was it. Like he didn't really make decisions until the decision to surrender, where he was like, we're surrendering. Like this is, guys, like we gotta surrender. In fact, this is a famous fact, people had never heard the emperor's voice until he came on radio to tell them that they were surrendering. Like he was that far removed from people. So again, it makes sense not to try this guy because he kind of didn't have any say in anything. Even if the government's like, oh yeah, Japan, the empire of Japan, and it's like, okay, but it's all, you guys are all doing your own thing. Again, they're terrible. So you have people writing into the home office saying, please don't hurt the emperor. You have a few people basically being like, yeah, like get rid of the emperor, completely different government. It was also funny, there's actually some communists in Japan who were like, yay, like, hey MacArthur, like, you should totally support the Communist Party. And I'm like, I don't think you understand, like, America during the time, but you do you communists. Good try. That was interesting. There was one letter from this guy who was in a factory. Again, the military was horrible. There was insane war crimes that Japan did in China. Like, so disgusting, I will not talk about them. Like, literally disgusting. If you want to read a really good thing about that, you should read Killing the Rising Sun by Bill O'Reilly, which I won't review. It's a good book, though. Read it. Yeah, it's really good. You should read it. Anyway, but they treated the military treated their citizens horribly, their soldiers horribly, and their, like, factory workers horribly. So you just had this, like, compounding of, like, rage, and, like, people who've been treated so horribly and also are kind of racist against China are going to go do insane, disgusting things. I would say demonic things, actually. Read about it yourself. I'm not going to go there. Anyway, so back to Japan. There was this guy in a factory who was, like, hated his job because it's horrible, grueling hours. I forget what he was making, some kind of, like, parts for some kind of military machine, and his factory got bombed, and he was like, that was so great, like, thank you, General MacArthur, I'll never forget the B-52s, and I'm like, okay, like, that's an interesting perspective. I never would have ever thought of someone actually being like, I'm so happy my factory got bombed. So this book is just chock full of weird, interesting, real-life things, and then the chapter about, presents, it's so cute. So, again, there was a lot of rationing after the war, and the Americans would give people seeds to plant in their gardens so they could grow their own vegetables and stuff. And this family, like, grew a pumpkin and, like, painted a picture of it, and we're like, this is our American pumpkin, like, here. And I'm like, so cute. I love it so much. But yeah, there was this, like, real, like, love, like, weird, like, love and respect, like, from a lot of people, not from everyone, but for the occupying forces. Some people, like, hated it. If you've ever heard the song, Sukiyaki, that, like, famous song from the 1960s, I believe it was actually, like, not a protest song, but about going to a protest and, like, nothing really changing, and you, like, walk back and you're sad and you're crying. Even though it sounds like a love song, it's actually about, like, that. Fun fact, I'm pretty sure. Go read about it on Wikipedia. I don't know. So yeah, it's really interesting, but it's also kind of sad because, like, MacArthur, like, he kind of respected them culturally, but, like, kind of, like, totally didn't care. So it's like, it's a little bittersweet, but it's a really good book and you should read it. Finally, I don't have it in my possession, unfortunately, but it is the best book ever and you should all read it. It is called Song for Nagasaki, and it is also by Paul Glynn, and it is about this guy, Takashi Nagai. So, Song for Nagasaki is basically a biography of Takashi Nagai way before the war and after, and it is the most uplifting book you will ever read in your life, by the way. So it starts out talking about him. He wasn't originally a Christian. I think his family was Shinto or Buddhist, but then he kind of became an atheist in college. And then he met this, like, girl at the house he was living in, the boarding house, whose family was Catholic. And he, like, totally fell for her. And she basically, like, converted him to Catholicism. So let's pause here. Whoop. Why are there so many Catholics and Christians in Nagasaki? Well, I'll tell you. If you are Catholic, you may have heard of the martyrs of Nagasaki. So way back in the day, there was huge persecution against Christians in Japan, like, insane. And there were, I think they were rounded up in Kyoto, 23 or 26 people. Men and children, by the way. Like, there was, like, one or two, like, 14-year-olds in the mix. 26 or 23 of them were marched from Kyoto. They were all Christian. They were forced marched from Kyoto to Nagasaki in the winter. If you don't know how big that is, like, Google how far away that is. Like, marched. Like, insane. And then they were crucified in Nagasaki, and as they were being crucified and dying, they were, like, singing hymns and praying, because that's how Christians do things. And basically, like, it converted a bunch of people in Nagasaki, and then everyone, like, went underground for 300 years. It's such a cool, it's so sad, but it's so cool. Like, I don't know, like, martyrs rock. And so basically, Christianity completely went underground in Nagasaki, and no one openly talked about it, but they secretly practiced it for 300 years. They would have, like, little statues that looked like Kanan, the goddess of mercy, but if you turned it around, there would be, like, a cross on it, because it's actually, like, the Virgin Mary. Things like that. Like, basically, like, they made it so that no one would know that you're Christian. Okay, so the government assumes that all Christians are wiped out. And then, 300 years later, the ports are reopened to outsiders, because Japan had a huge isolationist period. The ports are reopened to outsiders, and so there's, like, and Nagasaki is a port city. It's on the very tippy tip of Japan. So these Catholic priests, like, build a church, doing what they do, and these, like, Japanese people come, and they're like, "Are you, like, Catholic priests?" And the priests are like, "Yes." And these Japanese people are like, "We're Christian." And it's like, what? Like, they literally, like, came out of the woodwork. And they basically, like, for 300 years, some of them had, like, really strange ideas, because obviously they're going to have weird things if you have a disconnect from, like, the church body for 300 years. But basically they knew that if, like, Christians come back to Japan, they're going to be, their priests won't be married, they'll have the Virgin Mary, and there was one other thing where, like, you're going to know that this is, like, the religion that you're supposed to, like, that you've been worshiping this whole time. And so it was, like, insane. It was like, holy cow, like, there's actually Christians here, and they have been here, like, all this time. They survived. Again, many of them had strange ideas, but most of them, like, reconverted. I mean, they were already converted, but they were like, oh, okay, these are the actual ideas. We just didn't know. So that's amazing. And that's why there is that big population of Christians in Nagasaki. And so back to Takashi Nagai, his wife's father their ancestors were like some of those like hidden Christians. They're called the hidden Christians because they were hiding for 300 years. So anyway, that's super cool and interesting. So Takashi Nagai, he becomes Christian. He's also a radiologist. I believe he was in the military briefly, but he went to China, didn't do any hideous war crimes, and then he came back and he's like more old. He actually, the St. Vincent de Paul Society in Japan actually sent toys and food to the St. Vincent de Paul Society in China. Like, they helped each other, which is a very interesting thing about, like, religion transcends country. So you don't have to, like, hate the Chinese because you're both Catholic. Like, you can send stuff to them and they can help people there. The other thing about him was he was, like, incredibly dedicated doctor. Tuberculosis was a huge problem in Japan, and he would work with x-rays to try to look for tubules in your lungs and such, and he would do it so much for so many patients that his coworkers were like, dude, you're gonna get cancer. Like, you need to stop doing this, like, every day for so many hours. And he was like, yeah, but, like, they need treatment, so I'm gonna keep doing it. And shock, he got cancer. So he already has cancer before the bomb dropped. This is, like, an important part of the story. So he already has cancer. He, like, pretty much knows he's gonna die. And then when the bomb dropped and all that stuff that I told you about in this book happens, like, boop-a-boop, terrible things. It's really sad. But then he like has like basically double radiation. So he has like radiation from the x-rays, radiation from the bomb. I forget exactly what happened. His like organs like swelled to an enormous degree, but he lived for like, I think like 4 or 5 years or more like after the bombing, and he basically wrote like tons of medical journals and uplifting messages and things about peace. And basically, like, again, friggin' Catholics, like, blowing my mind over here. So their city had been destroyed, but, and one of their churches had also been destroyed. But they managed to, like, fish out this bell, and at Christmas, they, like, restored enough of a bell tower to, like, ring in the Angelus. Because, like, that's what they thought they should do. And then they basically, like, again, consecrated, like, their, like, loss and their deaths, like, as a sacrifice for peace. Which, might sound really weird if you're not Catholic. You're like, what the frig does that mean? So Catholics have this idea, it's called offering it up, where basically, like, we believe that, you know, Jesus died on the cross for our sins, but you can also, like, if you're suffering something, like, you say it to little kids a lot, you know? You're like, oh, offer it up. Like, if you are suffering, you can, like, combine your suffering with that of Jesus on the cross to, like, expiate, like, you know, you can use it for, like, to pray for the souls in purgatory as a sacrifice, or as a sacrifice to pray for someone's, like, well-being or salvation. The idea of sacrifice and suffering, you can basically turn it into a good thing. This is getting very theological, but yeah, because that's the thing is, like, I'm just gonna say this. So basically, like, if you've ever read Augustine, there's the idea of, like, doing evil, which is, like, choosing to sin, but there's also the idea of suffering evil, which is, like, you know, I got sick, or I died, and I always think of it, this is, like, Rose Corcoran original, so Jesus on the cross, he basically undid the doing evil by, like, dying and, what do you call that? Sanctifying people to get rid of sin. But I would say he also sanctified suffering evil by making it into, like, something you can sacrifice after the fact. So again, like, you're already suffering, you might as well offer it up. So these people, long story short, endured, like, insane suffering, but the people of Nagasaki were basically like, we're gonna offer up, like, our suffering, our communal, like, citywide suffering, like, as a sacrifice for peace. And it blows my freaking mind, like, that you could, like, go through all that and just have that as your idea. You're like, nope, like, we're gonna do this, and we should have peace, and yeah, like there's no bitterness or resentment there. It's just like, nope, like moving forward, we're just gonna keep going and work for peace and justice and goodness. And you should read Song for Nagasaki. It'll blow your freaking mind. It's so good. So yeah, and that's like the thing is, I really, really love things about, you know, post-war and World War II Japan, because they're so weirdly uplifting. Like the people in these situations and their ability to keep on living and living without bitterness, like, is amazing. So, highly recommend all of those books. 10 out of 10. See you next time.